Hi, Papercut here, and I want to help you get better at AOE 4. To do so, I'm building a video series that will explore and break down all aspects of AOE 4. From military to economy, from the beginning steps of the game to breaking down the most complicated aspects. I invite you to take part in AOE 4 School. Today I want to talk about unit comps. In my capacity as a coach and someone who watches replay reviews a lot of other people playing, something that comes up as an issue a lot is picking the right comp. Now, I could go through every single civ and give you the best comps, but that's hard to remember, and that doesn't actually solve the issue of understanding and learning how to play the game better, which usually just comes from thinking through the game better. So the goal of this video is to actually talk through the thought process behind unit comps so that no matter what civ, what situation we're in, we can still pick the best comp. Let's start out first with the counter system in AOE 4. On the surface, it seems pretty simple, a rock, paper, scissors style system, but in reality, it contains a lot more depth. I would say there are 3 tiers to this system. Tier 1 are the trash units. Trash units are made out of wood and food, and are called trash units because they're generally cheap and weaker units. They directly counter each other. So you have the archers that counter spears, spears that counter horsemen, and horsemen that counter archers. And we know they're direct counters because they actually do extra damage to their counter unit. Next, we have Tier 2, which is our heavy units. You can also call them gold units. These units are generally more expensive, but they also have higher health and higher armor. They're also a little bit more unique because they actually don't directly counter other units, except for crossbows. So let's look at them to see these examples. The first is the Knight. The Knight is a strong unit, high health, high armor, and it costs a lot. At the same time, though, it doesn't actually directly counter a unit. It doesn't do any extra damage. It's just a really powerful unit. Same thing with the Men-at-Arms. The Men-at-Arms has high health, high armor, but doesn't actually do extra damage against any unit. The only gold unit that is unique in that is the Crossbow. The Crossbow actually does extra damage against other heavy units, and is in this tier literally just to counter the other heavy units. Then we go to our third tier, Siege. Siege are directly countered by villagers, horsemen, springolds, and culverin. At the same time, though, Siege is created to actually fix the issues in the counter system, in my opinion. Has your opponent created way too many units and you can't catch up? You have your mangonels. Your opponent has put up too many defensive structures. You have your trebuchets and your bombards. Your opponent has created too much siege. Well, create siege in response with springolds and culverins. So while they are a counter unit, they're not a direct rock, paper, scissors style counter. This gets even more complicated as we add in unique units. Unique units either have a different playstyle altogether or have unique counters that no other unit has. For example, with the Chinese, you have the Palace Guards. Palace Guards are actually weaker than other men-at-arms, but they're faster, so their use is different. While being less of a frontline unit, they're more of an aggressive raiding unit that have different bonuses as compared to using a horseman or a knight as a raider. Another example is the Malians, who have the Javelin Thrower. The Javelin Thrower is the only infantry unit that directly counters ranged units, which makes creating a good unit comp for the Malians completely different than other civs when thinking about how to best deal with an opponent. Now let's go into the steps of thinking of picking your best comp. The first thing to consider is what is your civ's unique units. When using a unique unit, you need to ask yourself what makes it strong and what situation is it best used in. A good example of this is the Ottoman Janissary. The Ottoman Janissary is a glass cannon with high damage but low health. It is also really costly when it comes to gold, but it does directly counter cavalry units and does so much damage that it even does well against men-at-arms. So it's common when an Ottoman player, when they hit castle, to start making Janissaries. And all they need to do is create a front line of spears or sipahi, units that cost food and wood, to allow their Janissaries to basically outdamage anything else their opponent can put in front of them. Besides unique units, it's also important to consider unique upgrades that a civ has. So some civs might not have unique units, but instead have unique upgrades that make their normal units better. An example is the English and the Etruscan with their men-at-arms. The English have an upgrade that just makes their men-at-arms more beefy, gives them more armor. The Etruscan have upgrades that make their men-at-arms deliver more damage, both to normal and heavy units. So it's always important to consider what makes my unit special. The second step is to make sure your comp has synergy. A synergistic comp is one that covers its weaknesses and can fight most units your opponent puts in front of you. Let's think of some examples. First would be the HRE Heavy plus Siege. The men-at-arms hold a strong front line, and with the HRE's bonuses, can take on a lot more damage and output more damage. You then match this with mangonels and other siege, which allows them to take out the men-at-arms' biggest weakness, the crossbow. Another example of good synergetic comp is the Malian Donzo and Javelin Thrower. The Donzo holds up as a slightly higher health than the average spearman, as well as having a throwing spear, but they also counter the Javelin Thrower's number one enemy, Cavalry. The Javelin Thrower directly counters all ranged unit, the Donzo's natural enemy, but also does enough damage to hold its own against men-at-arms, making this comp very well rounded. Now, while it's good for your comp to have synergy, another good comp is what I would call the Overwhelm strategy. The Overwhelm strategy is predicated on building one unit in large numbers that is generally a strong unit. The goal of this comp is to create such a large mass that your opponent cannot create enough counter units to stop you. A good example of this is the English men-at-arms. You'll see the English do this in Castle or Imperial, where they're able to pump out an insane amount of men-at-arms to the point that you can't mass enough crossbows to be able to stop them, and they just overwhelm you with pure numbers. Many civs are able to do this sort of overwhelm comp with either unique units or unique upgrades that they have within their civ. The third thing to think about is economy. Can the comp you're running be supported by your eco? First, this is why it's important to have a comp in mind when you start the game, so you can macro economy to that comp. Second of all, it's important to make sure you're not running too many units that either have the same resource or play the same role. So for example, if you try to run a comp that is knights and men-at-arms, that's a lot of gold and will be hard to maintain. That's why you see people run comps that just knights and archers, with knights being the gold heavy unit and archers covering the bases of what the knight is weak to. This is why you see some people go the overwhelm strategy, because if you can get your economy set up to produce one unit, you can produce them in such an amount your opponent cannot counter them. Let's go back to the English as an example. In Imperial, the English have a farm upgrade, enclosures, that gives them gold with their farms. This easily allows them to then mass farms and then mass men-at-arms just off that farm production. The fourth thing to consider is the map. Maps will either have resource deficits or will be constructed in a way that encourages certain unit types they need to lean into. Example of this would be Prairie. Prairie doesn't have very much wood, so it's hard to run wood-focused comps such as a lot of siege or a lot of archers. And since it's so wide open and hard to wall, cavalry would become really popular. So even if you're running a civ that might be cav focused, such as HRE, you still will want to have some cavalry to be able to raid or defend different parts of your base. Lastly, it's really important to respond to your opponent. Even if you have the perfect comp, if your opponent does a hard counter, you need to match in scale and switch at scale, which means if you see your opponent all of a sudden flooding the field with counters, you need to get that counter out yourself. Games are often won and lost when people do hard switches and overwhelm their opponent before they can respond, which is why it's always important to keep up scouting. Let's do the process of creating a unit comp based on the criteria we have stated. Let's use the Abbasid as an example. The Abbasid have a lot of special units, such as the Camel Archer and Rider, as well as the Ghulam. Yet the Abbasid comp is unlocked with upgrades. In the military wing, you have Boot Camp, that gives you 50% health boost, and Composite Bows, which gives you 33% speed bonus to archers. We then look at the eco of the Abbasid, which usually goes 2 TC, has a lot of extra food eco bonuses, and larger villager count. This leads to a powerful comp of Ghulam Archer in the Castle Age. There's a reason why a lot of Abbasid players are geared towards that Castle Age power spike. Ghulams do double attack and hold an amazing frontline against almost any unit. Archers then shoot so fast that in large numbers they melt any unit no matter the type. Since both units are relatively cheap, the large eco of the Abbasids can just mass these units at numbers that make it hard to counter, even with stronger units. In both examples, I hope you see how thinking through the unique units, upgrades, and economy bonuses of your civ is the best way to construct a comp that will lead to the best chance of winning. Of course, it's important to state, if your opponent is able to counter your comp, don't stick to it. As I said in the step process, scouting and adjusting is vital. Your power comps will either win you the game or help you force your opponent to a counter that you're already ready to counter yourself. I hope this video was helpful to you. If you're interested in coaching or replay reviews, check the YouTube description below, and of course I can subscribe. Let me know any topics you want me to cover in the future, and good luck on your games.